Hello and welcome to the Orbit Extra, the show that puts you in the driving seat with live and immediate reaction to the very latest episode of The Orbit. I'm your host, Natalie Bromley, and this week the Orbit team have been marking the 10th anniversary of Black Friday and reminiscing on what happened that fateful day 10 years ago and exactly what the implications were of the collapse of Full Tilt Poker. Very shortly, we will be introducing you to our very special panel for the live Q&A this evening. But for those of you who have not yet seen episode 10 of The Orbit, here's a sneak preview.
I had 1.2 million in my Full Tilt account.
It was, how does payment processing work? How does this happen? What kind of segregation do the sites use?
I was wondering, wait a minute, I'm just about to join this company.
Right.
What have I just done, right?
Say, I didn't run anything. Oh, Ray run everything. That's a fucking lie.
I'm never going to see that money is basically what I would feel like. And a few days of just depression, crying at night. Like,
I was writing crazy stuff at the time. I was writing 50 best gin rummy tips, like anything that.
Within days, probably, I was on a flight to the Isle of Man that ultimately became pretty much a one-way ticket.
Everybody knows they should just keep the players' funds separate from, the business side of things, because why wouldn't you?
And I left it online. My joke of it all was like, well, I'd rather have my money on Full Tilt than on Bank America. I'm like, Full Tilt makes $2.5 million a day, is worth $4 billion. I'm like, this is way safer than putting it in the bank.
Hey everyone, welcome to episode number 10 of The Orbit.
Excellent stuff. Well, before we bring our panel in this evening, let's put you in control. Those of you who are watching this stream live, you have a chat box. We want to hear your memories of Black Friday. Did you guys have any money locked up in Full Tilt? But most importantly, let us have your questions to the panel. And let's bring them in. I am joined this evening by two superstars of the game, both of whom were right in the heart of Black Friday. Welcome to the Orbit Extra, Mr. Daniel Negreanu and Mr. James Dempsey. Excellent. Right. I'm going to kick off with a very quick question before we go to the chat box. Everybody asks you where you were when you heard about Black Friday, and everybody knows where they were. So I want to know how you felt. That's what I want to know. Daniel, let's start with you. When that news broke and that indictment was issued, can you remember what your immediate reaction was?
Well, yeah, I remember I was in bed and I have a home line, which nobody uses. Nobody calls me home. And my agent, Brian Ballsbog, at like 9 a.m., which is way before poker player hours, I looked and I saw that it was him. And I'm like, this is not good. Like, why is he calling me at 9 a.m.? So, of course, I picked up the phone. He let me in on the news right away. And he sounded a little bit frantic himself. So I remember just feeling, a little pretty anxious. And I went to my laptop to just see, like, can I log in? And, we saw the big shutdown thing. And then my mind started racing in terms of like, what does this mean? Are they coming to my house? Like, am I in trouble? So it was just really shocking that it happened so abruptly without really any warning.
Yeah, I think that was the key, wasn't it? I mean, there were warnings with everything that had happened, I guess, from Full Tilt. There'd been rumors circulating for some time, but the actual indictment themselves and Black Friday came out of the blue. James, from your perspective, I guess you were at the other side of the pond when this news hit. So was that a similar reaction to you, or did you feel slightly more removed from it with not being in the States?
Well, I think when the story broke, I remember exactly where I was, like you say, everyone does. I was actually in Dusk Till Dawn, and there was a tournament on, I can't remember what it was, but a reasonable sized tournament that a lot of the UK guys were at. And the story comes out, like the DOJ have shut down the poker sites. We're like, what do you mean? Anyway, obviously, being in the UK, I was like, damn, I had my laptop in my car parked outside. So I ran outside, got my laptop, hooked it up to my phone, got online, and we can still log in. Obviously, I know the guys in the US are having issues. I can log in. I was like, oh, okay, this isn't much then. This is like one of these stories it did wildfire around the poker room. You're like, oh, there's nothing to this. You get in. But then we're hearing more and more like the US guys can't log in or issues you can't access the website, all this kind of stuff. So I was like, I'm just going to withdraw my balances right now because we can do that. And then I remember I had a line of people in Dusk Till Dawn, like literally queuing up to use my laptop. to log in and withdraw their
Yeah.
balances. And like, thankfully for us, I mean, it was obviously terrible for the community in general, and it was bad for the games, everything. But if you were in the UK, it didn't, in terms of worrying about losing whatever your balances were, that wasn't really a thing. We got the money out, and it processed as quick as usual. So
Yeah.
it wasn't the instant financial panic.
That's reassuring, I guess, because I think that was definitely the implication for a lot of people. Daniel, I guess from both of your perspective, being sponsored pros at the time and ambassadors, and people in the game that people looked to rely on and give some reassurance. Did you feel in the early stages that your reputation had been damaged? Were you concerned about how this would play out from your, I guess this is your living?
Yeah, not even remotely was I concerned about, my reputation or anything. Obviously, government stepping in and doing something like that has nothing to do with me personally. And I also felt really, really safe because I knew who was at the helm. I knew that Scheinberg was at the helm, and I knew that they had everything under control. I knew going in that player money was going to be safe because PokerStars didn't dip into the docket. And when James says, we were safe here in UK, I'm like, you think you were, but you kind of weren't, because
right.
You're like, oh, we're just going to withdraw the money. I'm like, but there ain't no money.
Yeah, true.
They were using a lot of those funds to, keep up with stars, if you will, by spending a lot more in marketing than, because we were shocked a lot of the times we'd look at. We're like, so we had a show called The Big Game on Fox, which is, main network, and they had the Poker After Dark show. And we found out how much they were spending on that. And they're like, how in the world can they spend this much money on this show, right? When we're bigger than them. And now we understand how. They were using, player funds to fund a lot of these things, and they were also giving out dividends to all their owners, like on a monthly basis.
Yeah.
And again, this was all with a float of, they were trying to run the business like, most casinos would if, you don't have to have 100% of the funds on site, right? But you do have to have them. And, that's where they crossed the line and, put players at risk.
But I'm just curious, Daniel, because obviously you had the utmost confidence in PokerStars. Obviously, at that time, I signed with Full Tilt the sort of summer before, so I hadn't been with them very long. And to answer your question, Natalie, no, I didn't feel any responsibility. I think anyone would have known. I've just recently joined them as a Red Pro. It wasn't like I was in any way involved. Not, Daniel was obviously very integral at Stars and much more part of the face there. But was there like 0% sweat for you, Daniel? I'd imagine. I don't know when things start happening. I know, obviously, Mike in the show alluded to the fact that you kind of marked his card a little bit when it came to some of the stuff that may be happening at Full Tilt. But were you generally 100% not concerned about practices at Stars?
Oh, I was concerned with what happens next, right? So I was like, one of the first things I wanted to have happen was, a phone call with Eastside to find out, like, where are we? What is the plan going forward? And obviously, if, I can't play from the United States anymore, what does that mean for, my ability to promote, right? Because, like, one of the biggest aspects of being whatever you want to call it, an ambassador or whatever, is to showcase the software by playing on it so people have a chance to play on you. And I'm like, all right, well, I am Canadian, so I had those thoughts. I'm like, does this mean I need to fly back to Canada and move back or something along those lines for a period of time? So there was definitely a lot of questions in terms of, like, what do we do next if this thing doesn't get resolved? I was still hopeful that it would be a short-term thing, and that, we get back up and running, in the US, and it was just some sort of, whatever issue we had to resolve.
But I guess, James, then from your perspective, that question then applies right back at you. You were, particularly from Full Tilt side of it, did you not have any inkling that this was coming? Did you not hear any news or anything?
No, nothing. I was taken aback by it as much as anyone. I think if we look back and in the very aftermath of the event and look back at kind of, as Daniel says, the money that was getting thrown at making these TV shows. I was talking to a friend earlier about this today who's not in poker, and I kind of described it as the poker arms race. It was insane, and especially here in the UK where we had all the US shows being made, but also very aggressively all the Full Tilt shows and PokerStars shows, party poker shows, and Full Tilt was clearly spending more than anyone else. And as Daniel says, it was no secret that the sort of top dogs at Full Tilt were getting paid a lot of money every month. You'd hear these stories, you never know how much of it's true, but I knew what they were throwing at people like me, and I was thinking, I'll check my ego here. Like, how much value do I add to a poker site? I mean, let's be honest. If someone's heard of me, they've heard of Full Tilt. It's not like I'm not drawing much business. And if they're willing to throw this kind of money around, when you look back at it, you're like, okay, these things don't necessarily so add up. So looking back, yeah, maybe there were some signs, but whether it just be naivety or just, I don't know. At the same time, as Mike kept saying, you know, this site was raking fortunes a day. What was it? The number he was giving was $2.5 million a day. So I mean, it's
there was one sign in particular that I remember before this all happened, and let's just, to put it mildly, this was not a friendly rivalry between PokerStars and Full Tilt.
No.
This was not friendly. Like, Stars players were not allowed to play on Full Tilt poker shows and vice versa, and it was really, like, as you said, an arms race. But there was one moment I remember where, you know, PokerStars had a bevy of lawyers looking over, you know, practices in terms of transactions and different things, and there was one thing Full Tilt was doing that was concerning for the industry as a whole. So the lawyers at Stars through Eastside, like, we sent information to them saying, listen, what you're doing here by mislabeling transactions and stuff, this is going to bring a lot of heat, and it could be very, very dangerous going forward. They ignored it because one of the issues that, you know, they faced as a company was arrogance, right? You had basically a bunch of poker players who were like, we can run a business. It ain't nothing. And I don't know if you're familiar with the term, like the Dunning-Kruger effect, right? Where I'm good at poker. I can freaking run a business. And they never thought to actually have somebody who does come from that world to be a CEO. Instead, they had Ray Bitar, who was literally a guy who was just sleeping on, you know, Chris Ferguson's, you know, couch. And he was literally just the front man, the face. He's the one that's supposed to take all the heat, but he was not qualified by any stretch of the imagination. So I think when you look at the way the companies were structured, on one side you had people from the IBM world who were very, you know, careful and, you know, lawyered up, and then the other, you have this lobster-eating buffoon at the top, and a bunch of poker players who decide, you know, hey, we're going to do it like this. Don't worry about the funds. The money will keep rolling in. Woo, woo. You know, like that. As you see, the result was not surprising in the end.
Yeah, I think that's probably where I was most concerned about. I mean, I remember I only started playing around 2009, so I was still very much in my poker infancy when Black Friday hit. And as a recreational player, particularly one that's not massively involved in the poker world, one of the things that I was constantly facing was friends, family, my parents saying, like, what are you doing in this poker world? Get away from those online sites. You know, I didn't bring you up to be a complete degenerate. And then all of a sudden, Black Friday hit and this news becomes worldwide. And you've got people outside of the poker world in your ear going, I told you this is dodgy and this is horrendous. So I guess starting with you, James, as professionals in the industry and the ambassadors who help look after the recreational players and safeguard the reputation of the game, how did your attitudes change post Black Friday to being able to reassure people that this was not industry standard?
Well, it was difficult, especially as a recent Full Tilt pro at the time, and obviously Full Tilt in some form obviously never got back to it. Was sort of limped on for a while for the rest of the world players, and it was a real kind of awkward space. And in terms of reassuring players, I mean, it became pretty apparent very quickly that Full Tilt was a little bit of an outlier in this respect. I mean, let's face it, back then there was PokerStars and Full Tilt when it came to any kind of serious volume. And it was quite clear that PokerStars was going to be an okay and had done things right. And I think that helped to reassure it, basically because it was just that was all there was left to play on. So I don't think it needed too much. And as I say, obviously everyone in the UK kind of got their money in a timely fashion. So that kind of helped it from that respect. But it's certainly okay. Let me put it this way. I'm kind of amazed that we're kind of almost back. I know in the US there's only certain sites you can play on. They're all unregulated. They're all illegal in any way, shape, or form they work now. But I'm kind of surprised that people have jumped so willingly into them.
Well, there'll be a new generation of players who don't really understand Black Friday. That's the beauty of poker, is that every single year a new generation joins when people hit the benchmarks, the lower end benchmarks of age, and they come in and some of them have no idea. Daniel, from your perspective, obviously, I think this may have been an easier sell. I don't mean that to be blasé at all, but obviously, PokerStars very quickly positioned themselves in being the knight in shining armor, the ones that sorted it all out. And I think Eric touched on this in the episode, in episode 10, when he said that, straight away it became very apparent that Stars had ring-fenced players' funds. They weren't using them for operational purposes, and they started repaying people very easy. So that must have been an easier role for you in terms of reassuring people that Stars had a future.
Well, I mean, yeah, for me personally and for the brand itself, I mean, when you think of how well the business is running, when you have a contrast of the other side and you can see how different things are, it certainly makes you look like the good guys for sure. But I felt a lot of empathy for friends of mine on the other side, if you will, and specifically Phil Ivey, because it was very frustrating for me to read these sort of rumors circulating, that Ivey's the bad guy. And Ivey took this very, very seriously. And he didn't even show up to the World Series of Poker to play. He didn't feel it was right to show his face because, why should he be allowed to play at the poker table when other people's money's tied up? And, listen, I know Phil Ivey and I've known him for a while. I knew what was going on the inside. Phil had nothing to do. Like, if you know anything about Phil Ivey and James, I'm sure this guy doesn't run a company. He didn't have anything to do with decisions. What Phil did was Phil was actively looking to find people that could pay the players and buy them out. And so he did. He brought people to the forefront. He brought one specific, guy and said, like, listen, this guy will give us the money to pay for it. Howard, of course, was, doing his due diligence, if you will, trying to find other buyers. But I felt like they were very complacent and not realizing, like, you don't have leverage or bargaining power here, right? Somebody says they're going to give you the money. You just go, okay. Does that mean you lose the entire company? Yes. Okay. You don't have 3-4 months to look for the best deal when you have players out of money because of decisions you made to use their money, right? So, under those circumstances and the pressure they were under, the most frustrating thing was like Jennifer and, E-Dog and Juwan and all these people that really didn't have anything to do with it. But hey, they all did profit from some of the mistakes that were made and the ways that the dividends were divvied up. And so they were getting a lot of heat as well. And I just felt like the heat should lie in the correct place, which is Howard, Chris Ferguson, and Ray Bitar, which were really the people behind the decisions and, the process in which they screwed this up.
No, absolutely. I think whenever you get situations like this, there's often a situation where there's an explosion of blame and there's an explosion of questions being asked of a lot of people. Let's move into the chat box because we've got a few questions that have started coming from our viewers. The first one is from Kylie that's coming via the Flip website. This is always an interesting one, really, because poker players don't particularly like to burden themselves with a lot of regulatory things. And obviously they're getting down to the business. But her question came in and she said, how much and how should recreational players inform themselves? And what should they do to protect themselves from this ever happening again? And I guess I would expand on that question to say, should they? Or should they put full trust that this is never going to happen again?
I'll go first if you want, James.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, listen, you can't, there's no way to have any sort of full certainty on anything, right? So my suggestion to recreational players in terms of how you protect yourself is if you are playing recreational, view those funds as entertainment dollars, right? Mm-hmm. And dollars that if you lost them, they wouldn't affect your livelihood. They wouldn't affect, you personally all that much. So what I would suggest then is to keep an amount of money on there that you're comfortable if it did go poof, right? You know what I'm saying? I don't suggest that it will, but like, you don't want to be, so many people I know back in the Full Tilt days had like a bankroll of like $3 million, right? However, 2.95 of it was locked up in that account. That's not the best way to, protect yourself from, ruin.
Yeah, I used to have a discussion with friends all the time about how much money they had in these accounts. And it's funny listening to Mike in the episode saying like, I just kept all my money on Full Tilt because I thought it was safer than Bank of America or whatever. Like there was so much confidence in the site. It was obviously the thing was, it appeared to be booming. It was booming. I mean, let's face it, it was very successful up to that point. I mean, obviously the money wasn't there, but it was very successful. It was easy to get drawn in. In terms of recreational players, I'd say, how much caution should they take before putting into these sites? Look, it's like I was saying a minute ago, it's very easy when you're in UK or Europe, whatever. Just stick to the regulated sites, for God's sake. I mean,
yeah.
Do you have a 100% guarantee it won't happen again? No, of course you don't. But there's no guarantees in life at all. But as Daniel says, and if you're someone who's playing professionally, don't get stuck in this spot again, man. Like Daniel says, don't keep the whole roll in in a poker site. Just keep in there what you need, and it's almost certainly not going to happen again. But it happened before. No one thought it was going to happen then. Or maybe Daniel and some others, kind of with a bit of knowledge, thought things weren't quite adding up. But for the vast majority, for the recreational players now, I wouldn't sweat it too much. But just it is a possibility. Everything's always a possibility.
Good advice, gentlemen. Good advice. The next question that we've come through from the chat box as well, that's coming through live, is quite an interesting one, and it's talking back to some of the comments that Mike mentioned in the show, and he was talking very much about how he felt that he was taken advantage of by his friends within Full Tilt, and he was very animated about this. And I think one of the points that he raised that our listeners put in the chat box is that he mentioned that he and Eric themselves were actually on very hugely different money at Tilt. Daniel, as an industry insider and people who knew the individuals themselves, do you think that's fair? Do you think they did take advantage of him?
I mean, Mikey, I was laughing my ass off watching him, and I had this violin. When he described, he's like, I was making $40,000 a month, and I was blowing it, of course, on cocaine and bad gambling debts and whatever. And then when the money stopped, nobody would help me. Like poor baby, right?
It was painful.
And I will say this: like Mike failed to mention significant, makeup that he was in and debt he was in and playing online, and how much money he was actually in debt, and he owed whatever. So whether or not they were fair to him or not, like I think what he's saying, for the most part, is he believed that he brought a lot of value because he was on TV a lot and stuff like that, and he should be making more money because he didn't put money in the beginning to invest in it, and he felt like he was promised more money and things like that based on things. And again, that's where having an agent would help, so you can have sort of a buffer to make sure that you do get maximum value. But as far as like, I was glad to hear at the very end, Mike sort of acknowledged that he was being a victim, because it's exactly what he was. Like, it's very difficult for the average person to be like, man, this poor guy who was getting $40,000 to sit in his butt and play online poker a month, right? This poor guy, oh shucks, right? It's like, oh, now he has to go back to work.
I'll be honest, when I watched that portion, which was most of the show, I was cringing so bad. I was like, can someone step in here? Because you've got Blair one side of the screen, who legitimately was like coming up in poker, and as he said, basically he had 90% of his bankroll torn up in the site and had won his money. He wasn't being paid $40,000 to go on TV and just call Phil Hellmuth a moron. Like, this guy was like making his money and like all of it's tied up, and you got Phil going, they stopped paying me my $40,000 a month. And you had Steve there as well, who obviously on the media side, everything's gone sideways. You have to rethink your job. Eric going in there in the middle of a shitstorm. And it turned into Mike's upset that he wasn't getting paid his $40,000, and what a victim he was. I mean, hard to sympathize. You got to recognize the scenario here. Like, Black Friday hurt a lot of people, and a lot of American pros got royally screwed out of it. And
definitely.
Blair managed to navigate that, but I mean, a lot of guys just got cleaned out. Phil didn't get weighed in enough. I mean, Christ.
I think as a viewer, I was looking at that, and when there was a little bit of a reality check for me. I was like, it was the point when he said, "Can you imagine how mortifying it was for me? I was getting paid $40 whatever a month, and I had to start playing poker for a living again." And I was like, mate, I don't play poker for a living. I've got to go and do a job that takes a lot of hours. I've got to go and sit in an office. I was like, I'll swap you. It's okay. So it was definitely a reality.
One thing I do appreciate about Mike is that, and I think this is one of the reasons a lot of people do find him, interesting, is that he's very, very like genuine and honest with his actual, emotions and feelings. Like, he doesn't hold back. He's not phony. We do have a lot, I feel like, in, poker today, sort of a generational thing where there's just a lot of, inauthenticity, and Mike is as authentic as it gets. And listen, I think looking back, if he really, and again, like, I like how he summed it up by saying, he was being a victim, because everything I was hearing was like, oh boy, this, especially as you mentioned, I didn't even think about like Blair Hinkle, who was like not being paid $40,000.
Yeah, exactly.
$1 million. Well, and Mikey can't bet $20,000 on the Bucks anymore, and his cocaine feed is going to have to be funded by him actually, playing mixed games again. It was, it's just so it's so awesome.
Yeah. I'm gonna have to go back to playing the 400-800 mix, and now I'm gonna have to win for money rather than just playing for fun.
Now I can only bet $1,000 a game rather than 20. Wah, wah.
Oh,
It
funny
does,
that.
yeah, it does. I mean, I think that whole section though for me raised quite an interesting question about loyalty in poker, and I guess this is where I want to head to next for you both. He talked a lot about how he very nearly joined Stars, but he was talked into it by friends to go to Tilt instead, because he trusted them and they were his friends. And I think that's kind of indicative of even as a recreational player, we see this a lot. It can be a little bit cliquey at times, but it is also a very self-managed and at times self-policed industry. And this whole thing raised a good question for me about, is that a fundamental flaw in poker that we have such a small circle of people who self-police the game and self-regulate it to an effect? Or, does there need to be a greater effort for people to treat it like any other money-making venture and more of a serious business to protect against things like this? James, start with you.
I mean, that's quite a broad question. I would hate to the notion of not being able to trust your circle, not being able to trust your friends or your peers doesn't seem like a great world to live in. So
no, it doesn't.
I wouldn't necessarily want to be living in that world. Yeah, I mean, he said that he was led in by his friends, and let's go back to this point. I mean, it all fell apart because of this very poor decision that got found out. By the way, I mean, again, playing devil's advocate here, maybe they get away with this, maybe no one notices, and this war with Stars kind of peters out and they end up making loads of money, and no one ever knew that if they got caught out in this period of time, the whole thing would have come tumbling down. And then who knows, Mike maybe come out of this with his tens of millions or whatever he feels like he was owed. So whether he was truly crossed by his friends in this instance of getting in, I don't know. That doesn't seem necessary a thing. But I don't know what Daniel thinks. Do you want to have a world where you don't trust the people that you consider to be close?
Yeah, well, to answer the question a little bit differently, the idea that to address clicks, I can't think of an industry at all where there aren't insiders who make a lot of the decisions. It'll just happen, in any sort of grouping, you will have certain people that, at the forefront, and they end up taking the lead on decisions and things like that. And, usually converse with each other. I just think there's not really much you can do don't only speak to those 8 people. You need to talk to these 15. It's not realistic. And I don't see it as an issue or a problem per se. I think, what we need to do is, to scrutinize somewhat are these decisions accurate? Can we trust these people? And if so, they're going to take prominent roles in poker, and that's okay. We've always had that. And I don't think that, that's a concern.
No, yeah, I tend to agree. It was an interesting path that Mike was going down in the show, and I think it's quite easy when you are a victim of something or something bad happens in your life to push out and try and find people to blame and to try and to find fault where it goes. And this is probably a good linked back to when we're talking about trust in the process and trust, what recreational players can do to be assured that Black Friday was a huge thing, but their money's protected more now and it shouldn't happen again. Is to trust like you say, trust the people who are running the poker sites and trust the people who are brought in management roles from a business perspective, not necessarily like Daniel, you said at the beginning of the show, poker players who decided to run a business. I just thought it was a really interesting piece that Mike was saying when he was talking about his friends, because it's, I think that's a problem. It can seed distrust. And I think that probably doesn't help the situation. Another question that's coming from our chat box, if I can head this way, this is from Sia. It's rather than a question, it's quite an interesting one. And Daniel, this is probably one where you can give us an angle from Stars. She's mainly given us an anecdote from her experience of Black Friday. She actually worked for Pocket Kings in Dublin, who were working on the admin side of Full Tilt during Black Friday. Now, ironically, she was on the fraud squad, but she was looking more for bots and credit card fraud. But she remembers going into work that morning. Oh, it gets better, James. She says she was preparing for a normal day, and all of a sudden, not quite in full SWAT gear, but people literally stormed the building and they told them that's it, they're done. And 80% of the workforce had been redundant within a matter of a week. They kept a few people on to do it, and I think Steve talked about this a lot in the show as well, about how the poker reporting industry changed because their jobs changed. Daniel, from your perspective in working and representing the brands that you have had, you must take heart from the fact that there is a wider respect now for not just the players who are affected by things like this, but the people who are employed in the wider administrative roles.
Yeah, so Isai Scheinberg, one of the things that was important to him, was obviously when you lose such a significant percentage of your business, you would expect, people to get laid off. Like, it's just the natural, way businesses work. And at Stars under Isai Scheinberg, precisely 0 people were laid off. He saw the employees as integral parts of the company. There were probably some contracts that were adjusted. There was some, I know that for sure, personally. And, there was, probably some conversations held on that regard. But, like, they handled it with such class and grace that it really did elevate them to a place of separating themselves from everybody else by a wide margin. And I think that they were, as you said, seen as the Silver Knight. And then, of course, as Eric mentioned, they turned into Darth Vader after, the company moved on, because they're not the same company, right? Like, the company that I was with predominantly was run sort of, like a family, if you will, with Isai Scheinberg and Mark at the helm. And then, it got more corporate, and then, it switched hands, and now they're looking at, margins and ways to, profit even more. And, the players being number one, if you will, was no longer necessarily the motto. And that was clear in the decision they made much later with the Supernova League. So it's really an interesting look at, like, how you can be a hero. Oh, we love you. And then it's like, pitchforks, we hate you. That's one decision.
It's funny, though, that you say that, Daniel, as well, because a lot of the criticism laying at Full Tilt and by Mike in this was, how do they not get some experienced corporate people in to run the show? And then, obviously, PokerStars maintained its sort of small business ethics of the Scheinbergs being involved. I know they're obviously far more experienced and did a much better job running a company, but ironically, when they did end up selling and becoming more corporate, that's when they became the devil as well. So I guess you couldn't win running a poker site, right? You either stay.
Well, yeah, less about for me, my criticism with Full Tilt was less about being corporate, because they were corporate, but actually having CEOs with experience.
Sure,
right?
No,
like
I was just drawing the parallels. Yeah, obviously it's completely separate things, but yeah,
for sure. Yeah, like that's what I think a lot of people in poker don't understand is when you go public as an online poker company, you are beholden to shareholders, and if you do not, if you're irresponsible in such a way where you're just doing what's best for the player, but you're being irresponsible from a fiduciary perspective, like, you're liable, and you could actually go to jail for stupid things like that. So everything changes when you have people in a boardroom that you have to answer to that don't understand that you need a balance of winning and losing players, etc.
Yeah, no, quite right. We've got the money question. I feel like I'm going to put my tin hat on a little bit when I ask this question, but this is one for you, Daniel, it's come in. And it's in reference to a comment that Mike said in the show. And he said that he felt that Chris Ferguson was the good guy. So the question to you, Daniel, is Chris Ferguson a good guy?
Well, listen, I think all human beings have some good and some bad. I think that Chris was always extremely arrogant. Ever since, before Full Tilt, I always found him, to be kind of arrogant in that regard. And I was very disappointed in how cowardice he was when the shit hit the fan, if you will. And he went to Phoenix, Arizona, and hid behind the covers and didn't want to show his face or didn't want to speak. And, he's returned to the poker world and, has just jumped back in without an apology, with actually worse than an apology, sort of a shrug of like, well, what? You got your money. It's like, yeah, well, what about my interest? You know what I mean? And his unwillingness to do an interview, to really make that he made one sort of video, which was like I don't know what the hell that was. It sounded like he had a gun to his head. He was held captive, and it was just awful. Like, it didn't do him much favor, I think. And a lot of mainstream people don't know how involved he was, but he was incredibly involved. And for me, and I did this video years ago, but like this, so their whole motto was like, play and chat with the pros, right? Like, okay, well, you know what? We'd like to chat with the pros right about now, okay?
Yeah.
Because they're hiding.
We have some questions.
So, listen, I get lawyers. Lawyers are going to tell you not to say anything, et cetera, et cetera. No lawyer is going to tell me I can't do an interview and say just that. Say like, listen, I would love to share things with you, but I can't because, for legal reasons. But as soon as that's over, I'll give you the whole spiel and the whole story. And I think it's, if to be considered like a good person in this, you need to come clean. Tell the truth about what really happened from your perspective and own and acknowledge your mistakes rather than shrug it off and tell people. Because he did at a World Series of Poker, someone said something to him and he said, well, you got your money, didn't you? And it's like, he got his money, had no thanks to you, thanks to these poker stars bailing you out. So you don't get to take credit for something like that. And besides all the stress and anxiety that someone like Blair, who was sharing, going a year, 2-3 years where this is $1 million for a young kid. That's going to affect your ability to continue to make money. It's a brutal scenario, and there was very little empathy and compassion from him. So, good person, maybe in a lot of ways, sure, but in this regard, absolutely cowardice, shameful, no redeeming qualities about how he handled this whatsoever. I've nothing but disdain for how he's approached, the whole debacle.
Do you know what? That's a great answer, and I think that sums it up perfectly. I'm impressed with that. Well done.
I'm still not sure how Daniel feels on about this. I mean, can you get off the fence?
Yeah. I was going to say I'd follow that up. I'd like a little bit more clarity, though, Daniel. I'm not really sure you answered the question. I'm joking. James, from your perspective, did you know any of these people? Another question that's come through. Did you know any of these people personally? Like, could you give us any insight as to these individuals and I guess from your profession?
So I before I joined Full Tilt as a Red Pro, I didn't know any of these people on a personal level. I don't think I'd even played with Chris or Howard. Got to know them a little bit just when we were filming stuff in the UK. They come over. We did late night poker lounge, poker mini, whatever it was. They'd be over, and you'd end up going for dinner or something. But no, I didn't have a personal relationship with anyone involved. I mean, it seemed to me like to go back to that question, and I've actually spent some more time with Chris since it happened. Bizarrely, when he was kind of in hiatus, we were at a wedding. We were at a mutual friend's wedding, and I got to talk to him more there. And obviously, Daniel's completely right in everything he says. Like the hiding away is no answer when you've made millions and tens of millions out of something, and people have lost everything they have. But in terms of, he did seem very contrite about it, and he did strike me as. Without saying it didn't really come up. It's hard not to come up. There are poker players at a wedding and he's there. But it did seem like he was, I want to say apologetic, but he didn't apologize. And I'm looking at Daniel and I'm thinking, if I say that, he's going to rip me apart here. But it did seem to me that at least it had profoundly changed him. Whereas I've not seen Howard since all this happened. And it just strikes me, from what little I've knew of their personalities, that it probably hasn't changed him at all. It just strikes me as he probably just, I got out with some money. Well, on to the next.
Well, it's funny you mentioned Howard, because before Howard went public with a statement, we were not friendly, obviously. They were very upset with me because of, my stance. And after all this happened, before he after he did his Poker News interviews, whatever, he asked if he could meet me. So he came here, he was sitting right at this table, and we spoke for about 3 hours. And I did see a very different side. I did see him start by saying, I got to a place of so full of, he says, I got arrogant, felt like, we had all this power and it corrupted to a certain degree and that he made mistakes, but, that he really was. And I do know this internally, that every day in terms of working to find a solve, he was working harder than all the rest. Like a lot of the other owners were just like, I don't know what to do, but he was actively trying to fix this. And I don't believe he's a bad person either. Like I said, I don't think Chris is a bad person. I hate the way that he handled this. And I imagine he's got remorse, as you said. But I felt Howard's at least attempted. I don't think, I asked him, one of the questions I said, when you did that Poker News, series of interviews, like, how do you feel like you came off there? Right? Because I'm like, you didn't do yourself any favors.
No.
Right? You kind of were like, you were throwing other people under the bus. And there was what people needed to hear, I think, and this is true pretty much any time you're in conflict, is like, own it. Okay? Acknowledge, we messed up. I'm deeply sorry that we messed up. Here's what I'm going to do in the future, right? Some people will say, screw you, I don't accept it. But I think you can appreciate at the very least, instead of someone saying, wasn't my fault, I didn't do it. It's like, well, screw you. Taking the approach of owning it, because here, ultimately, this is what happened, right? You had ownership in a company that screwed players, okay? Whether it was your fault or not is irrelevant. You can come from an apologetic perspective there without, kicking the can down the road and, posting blame on different people.
Were you worried, Daniel? Oh, worried probably not the right word, but were you aware that perhaps a lot of your criticism when this was coming out could be construed as being quite partisan, as being in the Stars camp? And well, of course, Daniel's going to like throw some.
Yeah, of course he's going to say that. It's all right.
That's why originally when it all happened, I didn't say anything. I gave them time. I was like, give them time. Yeah. Don't say anything, especially coming from me. It's going to sound like, oh, look at us. We're stars. You're this. But it was months later when I finally said, okay, enough is enough.
Yeah.
I've been biting my lip for a long time, but this is getting ridiculous now. So that's when I did the video. But I definitely did give them a buffer room because, as you said, James, it does sound bad when, and I see that even today. Like, listen, I know that I'm with GG Poker. I know there's competing sites and stuff like that. I'm not going to spend a lot of my time trashing them. I'd rather people play on GG because they love playing on GG, not because I'm telling you why they suck or these people suck or whatever like that. I promote the product that I believe is awesome and I believe is the best. I'm not gonna try to be number one by squashing others, which is what I didn't choose to do that back then. Although, as you said, James, it could easily have been perceived that way. So I was definitely mindful of that for sure.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's what we all looked to as well. For people outside of the industry, we were looking for that reassurance, for somebody to step in and say, right, enough's enough, guys. We need somebody to take a hold of this. We are running out of time. I can't believe the show is nearly over. So I'm going to give one final quick chance for you both to close out with the very simple question. Has Black Friday left the industry in a better place? Daniel, you first. Simple question,
Yeah.
Let's round you off.
I was surprised to hear this question, and I would say unequivocally no. Like, I can't imagine that when you look at the byproduct of what happened with Black Friday, it's essentially, it started a trend to some degree. Like in Australia, there is no poker, and I don't know if it was necessarily piggyback off what happened in the U.S., but it set a precedent, right? And the United States represents a large percentage of the player pool. Okay. So when you eliminate them from the international pool, and we still, to this day, even though, as James alluded to, we have some sites where you can play legally in Nevada and New Jersey, there are unregulated sites, which we both don't recommend because, to answer the question about the recreationals, if your funds are going to be a lot safer on a regulated site than they're ever going to be on an unregulated site. So I don't recommend doing that. But when you look at the landscape in the United States, the ability to just play poker safely is gone, with international players and these big prize pools. Like, you have to travel. You have to take your laptop. You have to drive or fly over the border to Mexico to play poker in your underwear. It's so ridiculous, and it has not been rectified, and I'm unfortunately not all that optimistic about it happening anytime soon. Actually, I would say I'm not optimistic of it ever happening at the federal level, ever.
Yeah, what a
I do think state to state, we could see a progression if you get states like New York and others on board. And then somehow, if we can find a way to connect to international players that are not fenced in, that will be a big benefit. Like we saw what happened in Spain and France and Italy when they separated their player pool.
That was 100% a byproduct of the US gets taken offline. Right. Okay. So now you got the rest of the world. Now these other sites are like, right, we need to get our piece of it. It put poker kind of on the regulatory map. They put it on the horizon for, I think. I mean, these things are probably planned anyway, I don't know, but it gave them the impetus. Right, okay, guys, look at this. This is what happened when things got out of control. Let's step in here and not over-regulate, because I'm fully on board with the regulation. This market should be heavily regulated because it's a very dicey one. People got a lot of money. It's gambling. I'm all for it. But yeah, I think they looked at it and thought, right, okay, it opened the door to make it easy to segregate. As Daniel says, .fr, .it, .es,
yeah,
and as poker's coming back in the US, Daniel, obviously that's kind of how it's come back slowly, right? These really small sites, and we all know you want a poker site to be good. It needs liquidity. It doesn't need barriers. It just doesn't really work. But the one thing I will say that probably did benefit a little bit. I don't know how you feel about this, Daniel. I can see this going both ways, but obviously, live poker in the US has maintained a lot of strength. And I wonder, obviously, you've lost people getting exposed to poker by playing online poker, but the fact that you can't play online legally in a lot of places in the US probably has helped the live market.
Yeah, I don't know. I actually would say that, sure, it would appear that like people are going to play poker, so they're more likely to play live. Right. However, when you think of, or you look back at the World Series of Poker back in our day, and you look at the main event, right? And you see 2,000 players wearing Stars gear and
Yeah.
3,000 people wearing. That's all comes from these little $20, $50 satellites
Yeah.
that got people to playing in live events. So I do think there's a crossover, and anyone who does play online poker, they want to try the real thing, you know. So I think overall, I think poker's in an okay place here in the United States, but I don't think that a lack of online poker helps overall. I do see what your points are valid. That your points are certainly valid, but overall, I still think we'd be better off having online poker.
Yeah, no.
Yeah, what a way to end. Gentlemen, that's all we've got time for. We do need to let you go tonight, but on behalf of the whole Orbit team, thank you both so much for giving up your time. Our listeners are just absolutely fascinated to get that insight experience and just to get your views on exactly what's happened 10 years ago. For those of you who've not checked it out yet, do check out episode 10 of The Orbit for just even more unbelievable tales from that fateful day 10 years ago. And we'll be back for episode 11 whenever that airs. Keep an eye on social media and we will keep an eye out for that. I've been Natalie Bromley. This has been The Orbit Extra. Until next time.
I like that.